Imagine this. You're driving to work, thinking about coffee and deadlines, and an hour later you're in handcuffs for a crime you didn't commit. The judge looks at you like you've already confessed, and the only thing keeping you afloat is a lawyer who turns the courtroom into a battlefield. But what happened next? No one saw it coming. Let's start from the beginning. Jason Mitchell, 29, had always been the poster child for playing by the rules. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood in Chicago, he grew up with two strict but loving parents who drilled into him the importance of integrity and hard work. For Jason, following the law wasn't just a principle, it was second nature. He had a stable job as a software engineer, a clean record, and a reputation as the fixer among his friends. So the last place he ever expected to find himself was in the back of a police cruiser, accused of a crime he didn't commit. It all started one Tuesday morning. Jason was cruising through the city in his friend Ryan's car, a sleek black sedan. Ryan had lent it to him for the week while his own car was in the shop. Jason had no idea that borrowing a friend's car would land him in the middle of a nightmare. Out of nowhere, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Okay, no big deal, he thought. Pulling over, his heart pounded, but he told himself it was just a routine check. The officer approached, tapping on the window with that smug authority that immediately put Jason on edge. License and registration, the officer demanded, barely glancing at Jason as he handed over the documents. Sure, officer, Jason replied, keeping his tone calm. Is there a problem? The officer didn't answer. Instead, he returned to his cruiser, leaving Jason sitting there, stewing in confusion. Minutes later, the cop came back with backup, 2 more officers, and things went south fast. Step out of the vehicle. Sir, the officer barked. What's going on? Jason asked, now genuinely alarmed. This car matches the description of a stolen vehicle, the cop said, his tone cold and final, as if Jason's guilt was already decided. Jason blinked in disbelief. Stolen? That's impossible. This is my friend's car. I have his permission. Save it, the cop interrupted, grabbing Jason's arm and slapping handcuffs on him. The humiliation was instant and sharp, like a punch to the gut. People on the sidewalk slowed down to gawk, their stares cutting into Jason like daggers. Weeks later, Jason stood in a courtroom that felt more like an arena. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He wore his best suit, a charcoal gray number that his mom had bought him years ago, and tried to appear confident, though his stomach churned with anxiety. The judge, Gregory Harrison, was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Harrison had a reputation for being tough on defendants, and it didn't take long for Jason to realize he was about to become just another statistic in this man's courtroom. Well, Mr. Mitchell, Judge Harrison began, peering over his glasses. His voice dripped with condescension. First time in my court? I hope you're enjoying the experience. The courtroom chuckled, and Jason felt his cheeks flush with anger. But he bit his tongue. He knew better than to lose his cool here. Harrison wasn't done. He picked up a folder and waved it theatrically. So you're telling me you had no idea this car was stolen? How charming. Maybe your lawyer will juggle for us next. The crowd laughed again, and Jason's fists clenched at his sides. His lawyer wasn't even in the room, delayed by another case. And here he was, alone, the butt of everyone's joke. Jason's mind raced. How had it come to this? How had the system, which he'd always believed in, turned against him so ruthlessly? The next day, the courtroom was buzzing like a hive of nervous bees. Jason sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together, trying not to show how close he was to losing it. He had no idea who his replacement lawyer would be, and honestly, his faith in the system was already hanging by a thread. Then the door opened, and the energy in the room shifted, like a cold wind blowing through a summer day. In walked Elena Carter, and let me tell you, she owned the room from the second her heels clicked against the marble floor. She was 33, sharp as a tack, and dressed to kill in a navy blue power suit that screamed, "Mess with me, and you'll regret it." Her gaze swept across the courtroom like a spotlight, and for a moment, It felt like even Judge Harrison forgot how to breathe. Jason couldn't help but stare. Who was this woman? And more importantly, how had she ended up in his corner? He didn't have time to wonder because Elena was already moving, like she'd been planning the showdown for weeks. She dropped her leather briefcase onto the defense table with a satisfying thud, pulled out a folder thicker than a phone book, and gave Jason a quick nod. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I've got this." Elena turned to face Judge Harrison, her expression cool and unflinching. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. "We're going to need to address some glaring issues with this case, starting with the fact that the charges against my client are based on a tissue of lies." The courtroom gasped. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his lips twitching into a smirk. "Ms. Carter, I suggest you tread carefully. I run my courtroom based on facts, not emotions." Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she folded her arms, tilting her head slightly like a teacher who just caught a student cheating. "Facts? That's interesting, because the so-called facts here don't hold up under even the slightest scrutiny. Or is this court now operating on assumptions and convenience?" Harrison's smirk faltered. "Ms. Carter, I don't appreciate your tone, and I don't appreciate the blatant disregard for due process." Elena shot back, her voice rising just enough to make everyone sit up straighter. "You've already decided my client is guilty, haven't you? You're playing detective, prosecutor, and jury all at once. Unless, of course, that's a new policy you've implemented without notifying the bar." The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Harrison's face turned an alarming shade of red. But Elena wasn't done. She picked up her folder and began flipping through pages with the precision of a surgeon. "Let's start with the arrest," she said, pacing slowly. "The police claimed the vehicle was reported stolen. Yet the owner, my client's friend, never filed such a report. Funny, isn't it? Almost as if someone jumped to conclusions." She turned to the audience, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And then we have the interrogation. Hours of questioning without a lawyer present. My client was treated like a suspect before anyone bothered to gather evidence." Harrison tried to interject, but Elena silenced him with a raised hand. "I'm not finished. Your Honor, let's talk about the footage from the arrest." She held up a stack of papers. The dash cam conveniently malfunctioned, and yet multiple witnesses recorded the incident on their phones. Funny how technology seems to fail at the most opportune moments. Jason couldn't believe what he was hearing. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: relief. Elena was tearing the prosecution's case apart, piece by piece, and she made it look easy. By the time Elena finished her argument, Judge Harrison looked like he was about to burst a blood vessel. He tried to regain control, banging his gavel with a little too much force. "Ms. Carter, this courtroom has rules. You do well to remember them." Elena didn't even blink. "And you do well to remember the Constitution. Your Honor, I'm here to ensure my client gets a fair trial, even if I have to remind you what that looks like." The room erupted in murmurs. Even Jason couldn't hide his grin. Elena Carter wasn't just defending him, she was fighting for him, like his life depended on it. And maybe it did. For the first time, the balance of power in that courtroom began to shift. Jason wasn't just another defendant anymore. With Elena by his side, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The trial stretched on, but Elena's relentless pursuit of justice never wavered. She cross-examined witnesses, exposed inconsistencies, and left no stone unturned. Each day, the prosecution's case crumbled a little more under her scrutiny. Finally, on the last day, Judge Harrison's gavel hit the desk. "The court finds the charges against Mr. Mitchell now dismissed." Jason's heart nearly stopped. It was over. He was free. The relief was so overwhelming that for a moment, he just sat there, unable to move. Then Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's get out of here," she said softly. As they exited the courthouse, Jason turned to Elena, his voice choked with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." Elena's expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but her eyes softened just a little. "You don't need to. Just remember, this isn't just about you. This is about standing up to a system that's broken." Jason nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. This victory wasn't just his. It was a crack in the armor of a system that had let too many people down. Back in his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone, staring at the documents on his desk. The case was closed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. His reputation had taken a hit, and for the first time, he wondered if the system he upheld so fiercely might not be as just as he'd believed. For Jason and Elena, the fight wasn't over, but today, they had won, and that, for now, was enough.